Jake was a young man born and raised in a small town where life was simple but often harsh. His father had passed away when he was just a boy, leaving his mother to take care of him alone. She worked tirelessly, washing clothes and cleaning houses for the wealthier families in town. Though they struggled financially, Jake never complained. Instead, he focused on helping his mother whenever he could, picking up odd jobs around the town, fixing broken tools for the farmers, or carrying sacks of rice for the elderly. Despite his hardships, Jake had a heart full of kindness. He believed that no matter how little one had, there was always room to share. His mother often told him, kindness is like a seed. If you plant it, one day, it will grow into something beautiful. Jake never questioned those words, they became a part of him. One afternoon, as Jake walked along the dirt road leading to the town market, he spotted something lying in the middle of the path. It was a black leather wallet, slightly worn but still intact. He bent down, picked it up, and examined its contents. Inside, he found a thick stack of bills, more money than he had ever seen in his life. There was also a small identification card with a name and an address, Richard Thompson. Jake's heart pounded. He thought about his mother, lying in bed, exhausted from working too hard. He thought about the unpaid doctor's bill and the small pile of rice left in their kitchen. This money could change everything. For a brief moment, he hesitated. But then he heard his mother's voice in his head, "Do good, Jake. No matter how hard life is, always do good." Shaking off any doubt, he closed the wallet and decided to return it. The address on the ID led him to a large house on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of house that only the wealthiest people could afford: tall wooden gates, a garden filled with trimmed hedges, and a stone pathway leading to an impressive wooden door. Jake had heard of Richard Thompson before. He was a businessman who had moved to the town a few years ago, known for being wealthy but cold-hearted. Jake knocked on the door, waiting anxiously. A few seconds later, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a stiff expression opened it. He wore a crisp white shirt, neatly tucked into his trousers, and his face bore the look of someone who had seen too much of the world to be impressed by anything. "Yes?" the man asked, his tone clipped. Jake swallowed his nerves. "Excuse me, sir. I found this wallet on the road. I believe it belongs to you." He held out the wallet, expecting some sign of relief or gratitude. Instead, Richard Thompson narrowed his eyes and took it, flipping it open to check inside. After a few seconds, he looked back at Jake with suspicion. "Everything is here," he said slowly, as if he had expected otherwise. "You didn't take anything?" Jake's stomach twisted. "No, sir. I wouldn't." Richard let out a small, humorless chuckle. "That's rare." He paused for a moment before adding, "You could have kept it. No one would have known." "I would have known," Jake said simply. There was a silence between them. Richard studied Jake's face as if searching for a crack, a sign of dishonesty. When he found none, he gave a slight nod. "Well, thank you," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You can go now." Jake blinked, feeling a strange sense of disappointment. He hadn't expected a reward, but he had hoped for something, a smile, a word of encouragement, anything that showed his honesty had meant something. Instead, the door closed in his face. Jake walked away, shaking off the lingering bitterness. It didn't matter, he told himself. He had done the right thing, and that was enough. As he made his way back through town, he noticed an old woman struggling to carry a heavy basket of vegetables. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side. "Let me help you, ma'am." The woman smiled, her face wrinkling with gratitude. "Oh, bless you, child." They walked together, Jake carrying her basket until they reached her small home. The woman offered him a piece of fruit as thanks, and though he was hungry, he politely declined, saying, "As long as you're safe, that's enough for me." Later that evening, as Jake prepared a simple meal for his mother, he heard a soft knock at the door. When he opened it, he found the little boy standing outside, looking frightened. "Jake," the boy whispered, "I'm lost. I don't know how to get home." Jake knelt down. "Don't worry. We'll find your house together." He spent the next hour walking through town, asking people if they recognized the child. Finally, they found the boy's frantic mother, who burst into tears upon seeing her son. She hugged Jake tightly, thanking him over and over. That night, as Jake lay on the floor beside his mother's bed, exhaustion settled into his bones. Yet, despite the hunger gnawing at his stomach and the worry weighing on his heart, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had done good. But life, it seemed, had little mercy for those who lived only by kindness. A week later, his mother's health worsened. The town doctor told Jake that without proper medicine, she would not recover. But medicine cost money, money they didn't have. Desperation clawed at him. He worked twice as hard, doing any job he could find, but it was never enough. His hands blistered from carrying firewood, his feet ached from walking long distances to deliver goods, and still, the coins in his pocket barely added up. One evening, as he sat outside his small house, staring at the dirt beneath his fingers, he wondered if kindness alone was enough to survive in this world. He had done everything right. He had returned a lost wallet, helped the elderly, protected a lost child. And yet, here he was, helpless in the face of his mother's suffering. For the first time, doubt crept into his heart. Was kindness worth it? Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet night. Jake looked up and saw a familiar figure approaching. Richard Thompson. The businessman stood there, watching Jake with an expression the young man couldn't read. And then, in a voice that was neither cold nor warm, he said, "I've been thinking about you, Jake." And with those words, something began to shift. Jake stared at Richard Thompson, confusion flickering across his face. The man had been nothing but distant and indifferent when Jake returned his wallet. What could he possibly want now? Richard studied Jake for a moment before stepping closer. His sharp, calculating eyes softened just a bit. "I've been thinking about what you did," Richard said, his voice steady but unreadable. "Most people wouldn't have returned that wallet." Jake didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Take this," he said, holding it out. Jake hesitated before accepting it. He opened the envelope, his breath catching in his throat as he saw several crisp bills inside, far more money than he had expected. He looked up in shock. I can't take this," Jake stammered. Richard's expression remained unreadable. "You can, and you will," he said. "Consider it a reward for your honesty." For a moment, Jake was overwhelmed. This money could change everything. It could buy his mother's medicine, ease their suffering, maybe even allow her to rest without working herself to exhaustion. But a part of him hesitated. "Why are you doing this now?" he asked carefully. Richard exhaled, looking past Jake toward the quiet night sky. "Because I once knew someone like you," he admitted. "A long time ago." Jake waited. Richard continued, his voice unusually reflective. "When I was younger, I was poor too. My family had nothing. One winter, we barely had food to eat. But there was a man in our town, a stranger, who helped us. Gave us food, even though he owed us nothing. My father never forgot it. He taught me that one act of kindness can change everything." Jake watched as the businessman clenched his jaw slightly, as if forcing himself to reveal something long buried. "But life changed me," Richard went on. "I learned that people take advantage of kindness. I stopped believing in it." He paused before adding, "Until you." Jake felt a lump in his throat. Richard took a deep breath and straightened. "Your mother needs medicine, doesn't she?" Jake's eyes widened. "How did you?" "I asked around," Richard interrupted. "Your kindness isn't unnoticed, Jake. People talk." Jake swallowed hard. He had spent so long feeling invisible, never expecting anything in return for his good deeds. And yet, here was someone who had noticed. "Take the money," Richard said firmly. "Buy the medicine. Take care of your mother." Jake didn't trust himself to speak, so he simply nodded. He gripped the envelope tightly, as if afraid it might vanish. Richard turned to leave but stopped just before stepping away. "Come by my office tomorrow morning," he said over his shoulder. "I may have a job for you." And with that, he disappeared into the night. Jake rushed home, his heart pounding with emotions he could barely contain. When he stepped inside the small house, his mother was lying in bed, her breathing shallow. "Mom," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "I got the money. We can get the medicine now." Her tired eyes opened slightly, and a weak smile formed on her lips. "Oh, Jake." Tears burned in his eyes as he gently took her frail hand. "Just hold on a little longer. I promise things are going to get better." The next morning, Jake wasted no time. He hurried to the town doctor and bought the medicine his mother desperately needed. He also bought fresh food, things they hadn't been able to afford in months. For the first time in a long while, hope filled their small home. Later that day, Jake found himself standing outside Richard Thompson's office. It was a large building in the center of town, nothing like the modest shops and homes Jake was used to. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. A receptionist greeted him and led him to Richard's office. The businessman sat behind a massive wooden desk, reviewing documents. He barely looked up as Jake entered. "You're on time," Richard noted. "That's good." Jake nodded, waiting. Richard gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit." Jake did as he was told. Richard folded his hands together. "I need an assistant," he said bluntly. "Someone who can run errands, organize paperwork, handle simple tasks. It's not much, but it pays well." Jake blinked. "You're offering me a job?" Richard nodded. "I don't make offers twice." Jake hesitated. He had never worked in an office before. He wasn't sure he belonged in a place like this. I don't know if I'm qualified," he admitted. Richard smirked slightly. "You're honest. You're hardworking. That's more than I can say for most people." Jake swallowed. A real job. Steady pay. The chance to finally give his mother a better life. "I'll do it," he said firmly. Richard nodded, satisfied. "Good." And just like that, Jake's life changed. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. He adjusted to his new job quickly, learning how to organize schedules, manage deliveries, and even handle small negotiations. Richard was a tough boss, demanding, impatient, and rarely impressed. But Jake worked hard, determined to prove himself. Despite Richard's cold demeanor, Jake began to notice small moments of warmth beneath the surface. The businessman would sometimes leave extra food on Jake's desk, pretending not to notice when Jake took it home to his mother. Other times, he would test Jake with complex tasks, only to smirk in approval when Jake succeeded. Their relationship remained professional, but Jake sensed something deeper, a mutual understanding neither of them spoke about. One evening, as Jake prepared to leave the office, Richard suddenly spoke. "Come with me," he said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Where?" Richard stood, grabbing his coat. "You'll see." Curious, Jake followed him outside. They walked through town, past familiar streets and shops, until they reached a quiet neighborhood Jake didn't recognize. Finally, Richard stopped in front of a small, well-kept house. He turned to Jake. "I bought this," Richard said. "For you and your mother." Jake froze. "What?" Richard exhaled. "I know what it's like to grow up without security," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Consider this an investment. In you." Jake's heart pounded. I can't accept this." Richard gave him a steady look. "You can. And you will." Jake didn't know what to say. His whole life, he had given without expecting anything in return. Now, someone was giving to him. Tears welled in his eyes. He clenched his fists, trying to hold them back, but Richard noticed. "Don't get emotional," Richard muttered, looking away. "It's just a house." Jake let out a shaky laugh. "It's not just a house. It's a home." Richard remained silent for a moment before finally nodding. "Then use it well." Years passed, and Jake's life continued to change. He grew into his role, eventually managing Richard's business alongside him. His mother's health improved, and their struggles became a distant memory. One day, Richard called Jake into his office. He looked older now, though no less sharp. "I'm retiring," Richard announced. Jake stared at him. "What?" Richard smirked. "Don't act surprised." Jake shook his head. I never thought I'd hear you say it." Richard leaned back in his chair. "The company needs someone to run it. Someone I trust." Jake's eyes widened. Richard slid a folder across the desk. "It's yours if you want it." Jake's hands trembled as he picked up the folder. He looked at Richard, speechless. "You earned this," Richard said simply. Jake felt a lump in his throat. He thought back to the boy he used to be, the boy who had once questioned whether kindness was worth it. Now, he had his answer. With a deep breath, he took the folder and met Richard's gaze. "I won't let you down," Jake promised. Richard smirked. "I know you won't." And with that, the seed of kindness Jake had planted so long ago finally blossomed, proving once and for all that doing good always comes back.